Good afternoon. It's good to be with you. I know that we usually don't come on live at this time on a Sunday, but we had some audio difficulties with our worship service this morning. Those audio difficulties being that I forgot to turn on the audio. And I just wanted to make sure that we all had the opportunity to hear just a little foundational piece of the series that we're going to be engaging over the next several weeks. One of my favorite lines in Christian hymnody is from the hymn Jesus Christ is Risen Today, the fourth stanza, the first line, where we're invited to soar we now where Christ has been. I don't know about you, but I don't soar quite as often as I would like to. I long for it, but I don't always or even often experience. I don't, as Wendell Berry asked us to do in the poem from last week, often practice resurrection. I want to, but it's really hard to get, it feels like, from here to there. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be engaging a series called Emerge, a metamorphosis moment, and spend a little time thinking about how do we get from here to there? How do we practice resurrection? And we're going to use the well-worn but oh so apt metaphor of the caterpillar that becomes a chrysalis, that becomes a butterfly. Or a moth. Some of us are butterflies, some of us are moths. That's just the way that it is. And the reason why this week is so important is because that process begins in darkness. We're thinking a bit today about cocoons and tombs and wombs. Jolynn read from us from the Gospel of Luke, the first chapter, where we're told about Jesus' womb experience before Mary gave birth. And then she read from the Gospel of John, where we hear about Jesus' tomb experience before the resurrection. Both are places of mystery. The womb is a place that we don't completely understand. Wouldn't it be nice if we did? I think it might save us so much strife within ourselves and with one another. But no one knows exactly how a soul is formed in the womb. No one knows exactly what happens when we enter the tomb. Even when Jesus entered the tomb, did he go in and take a nap and God just say, okay, it's time to wake up? Did Jesus, as tradition tells us, go into hell during that time to defeat evil? One of my favorite images is from Eastern Christianity that pictures Jesus going down into the depths and pulling everyone back up and back out with him. But we don't know, because no one who has entered that experience is able to come back and tell us. Even the cocoon is a place of mystery. We still don't understand exactly what happens as a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly. I love the image of the caterpillar. It's one that I'm really familiar with. I grew up at First Baptist Church at West Palm Beach. I was there on Sundays and I went to school there during the week. And in the middle of the campus, there was a playground that had a big ficus banyan tree. And there's a caterpillar that only lives in a certain stretch between St. Petersburg and Vero in South Florida and only feeds on ficus trees. It's the Edwards wasp moth. And not many of those caterpillars on that particular tree that I think made it into Edwards wasp moth, because we would collect those and we would keep those caterpillars as pets. But we were all really familiar with that, as we're all really familiar of the story of the caterpillar that becomes a butterfly from our elementary school in later days. But that process begins as a caterpillar becomes a chrysalis, as a caterpillar is entombed in a cocoon. The process of transformation, the process of metamorphosis begins in darkness. Barbara Taylor Brown, in her book Learning to Walk in the Dark, says, new life starts in the dark. Whether it is a seed in the ground, a baby in the womb, or Jesus in the tomb, it starts in the dark. The problem, of course, is we don't often like the dark. When we find ourselves in those places of darkness, in those places of grief, in those places of change, sometimes, most of the time, our first goal is to get out of those situations. And I know right here in the midst of our faith community, there's so many folks that are in those grieving, darker, mysterious places of life. I think of those that are grieving the death of those that they love. Thinking of those that have received troubling diagnosis about their own physical health. I think of those that are in difficult places in relationships with a spouse or partner, or with a parent or with a child. I think of those that are providing care for those they love that are faced with physical challenges and mental and emotional challenges. They're places that we would rather not be, and yet we find ourselves there. They're places that we want to find solutions to. And yet, for the time being, we are there with the uncertainty, with the mystery. It's a place we don't often want to be. We want to get it over with. We want the transformation to begin. I remember an experience I had a few weeks ago at our Nehemiah action, as we were discussing the issue of mental health and substance use, and how we might as a county provide a better safety net for those that are facing those challenges. And one of those testimonies that was shared was by Sani Lackey, who talked passionately about her son who had mental health issues and then became involved in substance abuse and was in and out of rehab, not ever able to get the help that he actually needed, and ended up taking his own life. And she was just in tears as she was sharing that story, and gave us such an incredible insight into what it's like to be a parent, to have someone that you love that is experiencing those issues. But there was part of me that in the midst of that, as I was sitting there and thinking about the agenda and starting to feel the minutes tick away, and just being present to that difficult emotion, there's part of me that wanted to kind of leave there and move on. Let's get to the solution. And of course, the whole reason we're there is to find solutions. But it's also important to sit with the grief. I was so thankful for Joan, the woman that came up after from that committee, that just allowed us all the space to grieve with Sani and to be present with that pain. The change, the transformation begins in the darkness. Sometimes before we move on, we need to grieve what has been lost, what has changed. It was back in 2016, and I remember that because I remember we were in the midst of an election cycle, and I had a new patient that came on services with hospice, and he had a pancreatic cancer. It was an aggressive form of cancer, but even aggressive cancer when one is 96 years old, this gentleman was 96, it moves slowly. So he was on hospice for a while. I know sometimes we think of hospice as something that people are involved with just in the last few days before their death, but some are on hospice for months and even years. He had been married to his wife for 73 years. So that's about the upper limits of what's mathematically possible for time together. They didn't really want a chaplain to begin with. These were folks that were not just pillars of society, but the pillar of the town that they were from Wisconsin. This gentleman was a surgeon. He was used to being able to handle and fix all of the problems that came his way. That was his job. And he was really having difficulty coming to terms with the fact that there was something present in his life, something that was happening that he couldn't fix. And so as he spent some time on hospice, and the nurse finding that they were there for a long time every time that they had a visit, encouraged him, maybe you want to talk to the chaplain. And so they invited me over, and we went out and we sat on their lanai, and they made a point of calling it that every time that we went there. And the first time I went, there was someone that served us coffee, and I don't even like coffee, but I drank it anyway, just before this just wonderful but somewhat imposing couple. And we began to just talk about and be present to what he was feeling as he approached the end of life, knowing there was nothing he can do to solve it, but just to be present to it together. In subsequent conversations, we talked about his only child, this couple's daughter, who they loved dearly but were estranged from. She had been divorced several years ago when she was 53, and that was just something that they had a difficult time abiding, accepting. There was some grief involved, and that her life wasn't going to turn out the way that they expected her life to turn out. So we were able to sit with that grief and that darkness. And they eventually reached out to her, and there was reconciliation made in that relationship. And then I was able to spend time with this couple and their daughter. And their only daughter had an only child as well, a son who the daughter was estranged from and who they were estranged from. He was gay, and the grandparents had difficulty with that. The mother didn't have really difficulty with homosexuality in general, but that's not what she wanted for her son. She had to grieve the future that she was expecting for him and for her. And so we were able to sit with that grief and just kind of process that. And there was reconciliation between the mother and the son, and between the son and the grandparents. And before that patient died, there was a wedding held on their lanai at their home for his grandson and his grandson's partner for some 12 years. Before we can move forward so often, we need to grieve what we've lost, grieve what at least we perceive that we have lost. Allow some time to be in the darkness, to be in the chrysalis. I think about us as a church, our church and the larger church, and in a moment there's so much uncertainty. Marcia McPhee, who's a professor of liturgy, wrote an article in the Journal of Liturgy about how we as a church are in a metamorphosis moment. And she offers the image of us hanging upside down as a chrysalis on a branch, not sure what's going to happen. But she also reminds in that article that everything that the caterpillar needs is embedded in its DNA. You know, a caterpillar doesn't find a cocoon. A caterpillar doesn't even make a cocoon. a caterpillar becomes a chrysalis. It completely transforms. It completely transfigures. And that process begins entombed in the dark. Sometimes there's not a lot that we can do to move through that. We just have to take the time to trust the process. Again, Barbara Taylor Brown, from her book Learning to Walk in the Dark, reminds us, I have learned things in the dark that I never could have learned in the light. Things that have saved my life over and over again, so that there is really only one logical conclusion. I need the darkness as much as the light. Before there's resurrection, there's entombment. Before there is Sunday, there is Friday. And yes, we want to move through that to resurrection. But part of the process is realizing that where we are now is meant to be. That the presence of God is with us. That God has embedded in us everything that we need to practice and to experience resurrection. We'll encourage you to join us for the rest of this series as we move through the process of metamorphosis and transformation. Amen.